You can have intelligent people everywhere and still get stupid outcomes. Not because no one has insights, but because a society can systematically refuse the questions that would correct it. That refusal has a structure. Lonergan calls it bias, and when bias becomes ordinary, the result is social drift. In the last episode, we looked at common sense from the inside as a subject with patterns of experience. Today, we turn it around. We make common sense itself an object of understanding. We ask, what is common sense good at? Where is it blind? What happens when those blind spots become social routines? Here's a map for this episode. First, I'll define what Lonergan means by common sense as an object. A practical intelligence oriented to the concrete, the particular, the doable. Second, I'll define bias the Lonerganian way. That means not as a political insult as it's often used, but more as a systematic deviation from the norms of inquiry, a built-in don't ask that. Third, we'll lay out the forms of bias. Those are dramatic bias and the threefold bias of practical intelligence: individual, group, and general. Fourth, we'll see how these biases don't just distort private thinking, they generate public consequences. The shorter cycle and the longer cycle of decline, what I'm calling drift. And finally, we'll end with Lonergan's proposed counterweight, what he calls cosmopolis. That is, not a party, not a superstate, not a police force as may be created in the imagination, but a cultural and intellectual force that makes correction first possible. That means common sense is not stupidity, don't mistake it as such. It's one of the great achievements of intelligence. Common sense is the intelligence that deals with the world of this situation, that is, this person, this institution, this constraint, this limited time, this budget, this deadline, this risk. It's exactly the intelligence that asks things like, what can I do here and now? What will actually work with these people? What's the next step that moves the process forward? That means it's the intelligence that lives in the realm of the concrete. And it's not because it hates ideas, that it's antithetical to them, but because its success conditions are practical. You know you've understood when you can actually navigate the situation without breaking everything. And it's exactly that common sense that keeps life from becoming a seminar. We all know that feeling. It's why you can get a meal cooked, a classroom running, a hospital to function, a city to repair a road, a family to survive a crisis. So the question then isn't exactly whether common sense is valuable, because we realize just with those examples that it's actually indispensable. The real question is, what does common sense not do well? And Lonergan actually has an answer for that. Common sense does not naturally generate, preserve, or prioritize the kind of detached intelligence that corrects long-range problems, especially when the correction is unpopular or abstract or delayed. Common sense is pressured by immediacy. It has to be. It's judged by outcomes in the short run. And that short run pressure produces a characteristic temptation, that is, to treat the practical as supreme. The moment the practical becomes supreme, common sense starts to become blind to the very insights that could actually save it. It cuts its own legs from underneath itself. And that is exactly where bias begins. Now, when most people hear the word bias, they think of prejudice or partisanship. But Lonergan is after something more structural when we use that term. Bias is not merely having a perspective. Everyone has a perspective. Bias is what happens when the perspective itself becomes a refusal. It's totalizing in its refusal. So when I say that, I don't mean a conscious refusal necessarily. Often it's actually far more ordinary than that. Bias is the systematic tendency not to notice certain data, not to entertain certain questions, not to tolerate certain conclusions, not to allow inquiry to run its full course. Bias is a kind of like a built-in stop sign placed inside your own knowing. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. It closes questioning off. And even worse, it doesn't usually announce itself as bias. It announces itself as obviousness. That's obvious the case, right? It's just common sense. Everyone knows that's not realistic. In the academic field, that's academic. That won't work. That's too complicated. Just not simply the way the world is. Always at the concrete. Now, that's not to say that sometimes those phrases aren't legitimate. They are. But oftentimes, those phrases, those axioms, are used as a bludgeon, as a mask. Bias masks itself by shortening the process of knowing. And in doing so, what it does is it blocks attentiveness. It blocks intelligence. It blocks reasonableness. It blocks responsibility, the transcendental precepts. And once you consciously see that, once you attend to it, you can then understand why bias can be socially catastrophic while simultaneously remaining psychologically comfortable. It's exactly because bias doesn't feel like evil that it feels like relief that makes it so dangerous. It's relief from the burden of questioning. Lonergan's first major form of bias is dramatic bias. And that's not being emotional. That's not what that means. Emotions are not the enemy of intelligence. No. So let's not confuse one with the other. Dramatic bias is the distortion that occurs when the dramatic pattern of experience, remember the previous episode, those are our fears, our desires, our resentments, self-protective stories we tell ourselves, starts to screen what we see, what we can ask, what we can bear to conclude. So, how do we recognize it? Here's the simplest way to recognize it. You have a moment when an insight is on the edge of appearing, tip of your tongue, something you could understand, but instead, you feel a surge of discomfort, and your mind swerves. It takes a detour. Maybe you change the subject when you're right at the edge. Some of us use comic relief. We make a joke, and we take a detour. Maybe when we realize it, we get irritated. We try to rationalize it away, maybe. Or suddenly you become busy. Or suddenly you feel really tired and you procrastinate. That is not merely mood. It can actually be a cognitive defense. The dramatic pattern creates what Lonergan calls a scotosis, or a blind spot. You don't just refuse the conclusion, you're actually refusing the data and questions that would force the conclusion. And because this is preconceptual, it often shows up as selective memory. What does that mean? You remember what supports your self-image, and conversely, you forget what would threaten it. And don't mistake this as it's not a deliberate lie, but rather a patterned omission. Now, this dramatic bias matters socially because social life is not a debate club. Social life is thick with identity, with status. Things like shame, loyalty, fear, pride. And when dramatic bias becomes common, entire whole communities can become unable to think certain thoughts. That's the first layer. And it already seems extreme enough, but Lonergan doesn't stop there, because even if you set dramatic bias aside, practical intelligence has its own distortions. He identifies a threefold bias of the practical subject. Those are, as I mentioned, individual, group, and general. Individual bias, the short-run self. Individual bias is the egoist distortion of practical intelligence. So that means, don't confuse this with self-care. It's not self-care. It's not legitimate self-interest. What it actually is the refusal of the wider good when the wider good conflicts with my advantage. So what would the individual bias say? What would I say if I was trapped in the individual bias? I know what's right, but I'm not paying the cost. I see the point, but I want the benefit without the burden. I'll take the shortcut. I'll let others carry the consequences. I'm sure to one degree or another, we're all familiar with this kind of bias. Individual bias is easy to see in petty corruption. Things like cutting the line, cheating on taxes, lying in a report, taking credit, dodging responsibility. But its more important form is not petty, it's actually strategic. It's when the egoist becomes clever and turns intelligence into a tool of evasion. Then the mind becomes productive, but in the wrong direction, inventing reasons not to be responsible. And when enough individuals do that, the system becomes in itself cynical. Still, however, Lonergan's key point is that the individual bias isn't even the most dangerous form, because society has mechanisms to punish obvious egoism. So then what is the deeper danger? The deeper danger is group bias. And group bias is when a group, typically a dominant group, systematically prefers its own advantage and builds a rationalized worldview to protect it. So that means it's not merely people like their tribe that's overly simplistic and reductive. It's way too weak to think of it in that way, the tribalistic sense. Group bias is when the group uses institutions, it uses narratives and policy to make its advantage look like the natural order of things, this status quo. And it becomes especially dangerous because group bias does not simply pursue interest. It's not so simple. It produces principles like ideologies, slogans, and even things like moral alibis that universalize the group's self-interest. And those principles can survive long after the original situation in which they were birthed changes. This is why group bias creates a characteristic pattern of decline. Lonergan calls it the shorter cycle, the dialectic where group advantage blocks needed reforms, creating things like dysfunction. The dysfunction creates unrest. The unrest shifts power, and then the cycle repeats, often with myth-making at every turn in order to justify these movements. And I think we can all recognize and see it in institutions that refuse reform until a crisis forces it. You can see it in industries that block regulation until disaster makes regulation inevitable. You can see it in political coalitions that treat any criticism as betrayal until reality breaks the coalition. And crucially, group bias is accompanied by a cultural phenomenon, that is, the production of myths and catchwords. The old regime becomes purely monstrous. The new regime becomes purely virtuous. Slogans that are birthed become unquestionable, and therefore, bad ideas ride in on fashionable banners. Good ideas are ignored unless they dress themselves in acceptable premises. Once you see that pattern, you simply cannot unsee it. But even group bias is not the deepest. because group bias at least has an intelligible motive, that is, advantage. The deepest and most civilizationally corrosive is what Lonergan calls the general bias of common sense. What is that? The general bias is the bias of practical intelligence as such. It's not about your personal egoism, and it's not even about your group's privilege or any group's privilege, the dominating group. What's it actually about? It's about the built-in tendency of common sense, remember our definition, to discount insights that do not pay off immediately in the practical order. So that seems abstract, but okay, so what does general bias say? What do people who fall into the general bias say? If it doesn't solve a concrete problem now, it isn't real. If it isn't measurable in today's terms, it's useless. If it doesn't give me immediate leverage, it's just talk, mere talk. General bias has a special hostility towards things like foundational critique, long-range planning, things like theoretical integration. Remember, it's all about the practical. Moral demands that require sacrifice now for goods later. It's a form of psychopathology. It's especially hostile towards things like cultural and educational formation that bears fruit slowly over time. And it's exactly because those are the things that prevent collapse, those things there, that general bias is the permanent source of the longer cycle of decline. The longer cycle is not just things like bad leaders or a corrupt political party. What it actually is a slow degradation in the conditions for correction. Eventually, those things become unthinkable. Culture becomes increasingly subordinated to practicality. Education becomes nothing else but training. Familiar? Journalism becomes propaganda or entertainment. Public discourse becomes catchwords. Theoretical production replaces genuine deliberation. All familiar, no? You can have magnificent setting, technology, infrastructure, spectacle, and still have no play. And in that situation, practicality is condemned to ruin because it has destroyed its own corrective principle. That is Lonergan's diagnosis. That is, not the common sense is evil, but that common sense, left to itself, cannot reliably correct itself. Which begs the question, so what corrects it? Lonergan's answer is in his famous, often misunderstood proposal, to be fair, cosmopolis. So, cosmopolis should not be confused as a party denouncing other parties. No, it's not a superstate ruling states, the super centralizing state. No, it's not an organization that enrolls members. Nor is it even a legal court or an academy that stamps opinions. No, none of those things. What cosmopolis actually is a dimension of consciousness itself. That is, the special role of detached intelligence, historically aware and responsible, operating as a cultural corrective. It stands far above partisan practicality in order to save practicality from destroying itself. Now, I know that sounds vague until you name its jobs, what it does. Cosmopolis has to do at least 4 things in order to be what it needs to be. First, it has to keep society from living off rationalized nonsense. It has to ridicule, explode, dismantle the rationalizations by which group egoism universalizes itself. Second, it has to protect the future from myth-making. It has to prevent the formation of screening memories and falsified histories that let each new regime rewrite the past in order to justify itself now. The third thing it has to do, it has to make operative ideas that are correct but inoperative. This is a key Lonerganian point. Often people will agree an idea is correct, but they won't act on it because they assume it can't work unless backed by force, fear, or desire. Cosmopolis breaks that vicious circle by witnessing to the operability of ideas without coercive backing. And fourth, Cosmopolis requires critique, especially critique of history. Because if Cosmopolis itself is blind, the blind lead the blind. So Cosmopolis is not some sort of naive optimism. Don't confuse it as such, although it may seem like that, it's not. It is not sweetness and light. What it actually is hard cultural labor to raise the level of public intelligence without reducing intelligence to propaganda. And don't think of Cosmopolis as above politics, as that kind of like escapism. It's above politics in the way truth is above politics. Not because politics doesn't matter, but because politics destroys itself when it is not corrected by what is not political. Now, let's turn this into practice without falling into the general bias of common sense. If you want to become immune to the drift, here are some concrete moves we can make. The first thing is, learn to name the avoided question. When you feel irritation or fatigue at the line of inquiry, ask yourself, what question am I refusing? Second, learn to distinguish three temptations in your own thinking. The one of individual bias, I don't want to pay the cost. The one of group bias, my side must be right. And the third, concerning general bias, if it isn't immediately practical, it isn't real. Okay? Those are the three for the second. Third, refuse catchwords. Catchwords are verbal shortcuts that replace inquiry, replace that labor of judgment. They compress complex realities into moral reflexes. If you can't state the relevant evidence and the relevant distinctions, you don't have an opinion. What you actually have is just a password to the culture. Fourth, cultivate the cosmopolitan stance in miniature. What that means is become the kind of person who can appreciate and criticize, who can honor the good in the old and the new, who can think historically, who can resist both the tendency towards cynicism and utopianism. Cosmopolis is not first an institution. It is first a habit of mind, one that can then become cultural. So if I have to put the thesis of the episode simply, common sense is a genuine intelligence. It's an intelligence that's aimed at the concrete, but common sense, left to itself, develops characteristic biases: dramatic, individual, group, and general. These biases generate social drift, the shorter cycle of power and myth, and then the longer cycle where culture capitulates to practicality and loses the power to correct it. The only adequate counterweight is Cosmopolis, detached yet effective intelligence, historically responsible, culturally operative, making correction possible. That's a lot, but we'll move on in the next episode. And in the next episode, we'll move from diagnosis to the deeper positive account. That is how progress and decline interweave in a developing world, and what it means to be responsible inside that historical dialectic. If this clarified your own experience of bias and drift, I hope you like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next.